Hi, it's time for another verb of the day. Today's verb is pardon. And today's verb was suggested by the viewer Louise, so thank you so much for that idea. Now, let's take a moment and review some of the definitions or the ways that we use this verb. The first way you might hear pardon used can mean to forgive or excuse an error, an offense, or an inconvenience. So this phrase or verb, I should say, really is used in a very polite way, or frequently used in that way, to ask people for forgiveness, sort of recognizing, I made a mistake, or I'm somehow inconveniencing you. A second way you hear pardon used is to mean to release a convicted offender from the legal consequences of their offense. Okay? So many times this might mean someone is being released from prison. In certain U.S. states, it could be that someone is no longer going to be on death row, possibly receiving the death penalty for their crime. We'll see some examples, and we'll keep talking about that as our video goes along. A third way pardon gets used is in order to indicate that someone's actions or their thoughts are justified or understandable under the circumstances. Right? So I know I've thought this. I don't know if I've used this exact words with students, but when a student has told me there's been a death in the family, and I can see they're struggling to sort of pay attention or focus, right? I would pardon maybe their lack of focus, right? It's understandable that maybe today is just not going to be their best day because they've got a lot going on outside of our lessons. For now, you should know that pardon is a regular verb. To make the progressive form of this verb, all you need to do is add ing to form pardoning. The past tense and the participle forms of our verb can be made by adding ed. Our base verb, pardon, ends in a voiced N sound. This means the ed ending is just going to make a D sound. I'm not going to add an extra syllable as I say it. So the past tense and the participle forms should sound like this: pardoned, pardoned. Okay. Now, I do have some phrasal verbs for us to discuss. You're going to see here the definitions aren't all that different, but I like for us to have some examples to look at. So the most common way you'll hear pardon used as a phrasal verb is with pardon for. The first way we could use that phrasal verb is to, again, go back to our definition of forgiving or excusing someone for some type of wrong or error or possibly even a crime. An example of this: the teacher will pardon you for missing one class, right? So this person's not unreasonable, right? They're trying to say like, they'll forgive it or they'll excuse you from that one class. A second way to use pardon for, again, is to issue kind of a formal what's called a pardon, and we'll talk about the noun form of that word. So, but it's sort of a legal decision that's going to overturn a conviction and release someone from prison. So this goes back to that second definition we were just talking about. An example of this: the governor has pardoned him for accepting responsibility and not only rehabilitating himself, but many others too. So people get pardoned for different reasons. In this instance, right, they're recognizing someone took responsibility for whatever crime it is that was committed. He's been working on improving himself and others who happen to be incarcerated as well. Now let's continue using our verb of the day in a couple different verb tenses. Today we'll review the imperative and the simple future. Let's start with the imperative. This is rather unique in English. If you're a regular viewer of these videos, you probably get a little bored with me beginning. We're going to start with a subject and right, describing our process. Here, it's very different. The imperative is unique in English. There is no stated subject, right? So our sentences can just begin with the base verb. Our subject in our sentences are understood to be either you singular or you plural. It just depends on how many people you're speaking or communicating with. Okay? So an example in the affirmative might be if someone says, "Pardon me for my tardiness," right? They're asking, "Forgive me," right? So really just another way to say, "I'm sorry I'm late." Okay? And many times people would find pardon to be a bit more formal. Okay? Now, if you want to make a negative imperative, what we do is we start with do not, or the contraction don't, and then the base verb. So again, there's no stated subject in either the affirmative or the negative. So an example of this might be, "Don't pardon him for his rude behavior," right? So here we're sort of advising or commanding someone, don't forgive him. Don't excuse that bad behavior. They might think, the person's just going to keep doing it without indicating that there's going to be a change or improvement. So these first two examples very much go back to the first definition of our verb. Okay? You're going to notice there are no yes or no questions in the imperative. So we'll move on and talk a little bit about the simple future. Today we're going to focus on making sentences with be going to. This is most commonly used as people talk about their plans, particularly as they get rather confident in what is going to happen. Okay? It's a little less common to hear it with predictions, promises, or offers, but you still might encounter that occasionally. The thing we have to remember about the simple future here is that our verb is going to change based on what our subject is. And that's because the be verb has three forms in the present tense. So if my subject is I'm going to use am, going to, and the base verb. If the subject is he, she, or it, I use is going to, and then the base verb. And finally, if my subject is you, we, or they, I'll use are going to, and then the base verb. Let's take a look at an example here. If we follow this logic, presidents are going to pardon themselves from anything that they might be charged with committing. Okay? This sentence comes really from the news. In the United States, we've had some court cases kind of challenging whether a president can be charged with crimes. Are they immune from that? And this is being argued before many justices at different levels within our judicial system here in the United States. So borrowed this. Someone was kind of questioning one side to walk through, okay, if we make this rule, right, and then kind of making, we might say even a bit of prediction about what is going to happen in the future. Okay. The reason you see are there is our subject presidents is plural. Now let's look at a negative sentence, another thing from our news here. But again, we'll start with our subject. We'll use the form of be that matches, so am, is, or are, then not, going to, and the base verb. Here's another example. The president isn't going to pardon his son. Okay. So as this is being recorded in the summer of 2024, you may be aware that the United States president was the U.S. president's son was convicted of a crime earlier in the year, and people immediately asked, right, are you going to kind of legally forgive this crime, prevent him from possibly in time, right? And the response to this has been no, right? That is not the plan, okay? Lastly, let's take a look at making a yes or no question in the simple future. To do this, we start with a form of be, so it can be am, is, or are, then our subject, then going to, and the base verb. Here's my last one. Is the governor going to pardon people with misdemeanor marijuana possession convictions? And I apologize, that looks a little funny on how some of the spacing worked there, but possession continues on to the last line there, right? And so again, we're asking, sometimes this is a press secretary, someone charged with speaking for our elected officials. What is the plan? Okay. All of those sentences in the simple future there are examples of the second definition of our verb pardon. Now let's spend a moment looking at some words in a phrase related to this verb pardon. The first word we're going to discuss is just the noun form of our verb. The noun pardon has the exact same pronunciation and the exact same spelling. It can also have a couple different meanings. So the first way we could use it is to talk about the action of forgiving or being forgiven for some type of error or offense. An example of this: the priest gave a pardon to the parishioner. Okay? So sometimes we see this used in connection to religion and this sort of idea that a higher being can forgive us for our sins. Or again, you might think of those like errors, mistakes, offenses. Another way to use the noun pardon is to talk about the remission, right, or kind of taking away of our legal consequences to an offense or a conviction. So this goes back to that second definition of the verb. The governor issued 10 pardons before her term ended. Okay, so 10 people who had been convicted of crimes were likely released from prison. Another way to use pardon is as an exclamation. So many times it's being used as a request to a speaker. It might be, can you repeat something? Because I either didn't hear it or maybe I didn't understand what you were saying. So this example is a little harder to set up because you have to pretend. Maybe there's one person talking with you, could be in a group, it could be in a loud environment, but someone says something to you, right, or is trying to give you information, and you might kind of go, pardon? Right? And what's unique here is sort of your voice many times is going to rise because this is indicating a question like, I didn't understand that. Pardon? Right? What was your phone number? Right? So here that might be telling someone, I need you to repeat the area code and digits. Now, one last phrase for us to talk about today. Maybe you've heard people say, I beg your pardon. This is a very polite phrase, and it's being used to express an apology, right? So it's a little similar to saying, I'm sorry for this thing. Okay, an example. I beg your pardon for interrupting, but we have an emergency. Right? So maybe in a more formal work environment, you might hear something a bit similar to this, but really the person is saying, I'm sorry for interrupting, but I need you. There's something that is rather urgent. Thank you to Luis for suggesting today's verb, and thank you all for watching. I hope you all have a wonderful day.